Good evening. Welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's program with Dr. Don James McLaughlin on his book, Phobia and American Literature, 1705 to 1937, A Therapeutic History. The AAS is located on the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc community who remain an active presence here in central Massachusetts. I'm Sharon Block, moderator today. I'm a professor of history and the Associate Vice Chancellor for Equity and Faculty Development at the University of California, Irvine. Most importantly, I have the privilege of serving on the AAS Council. As a national research library, the American Antiquarian Society's mission is to cultivate a deeper understanding of the American past that is grounded in primary sources like those in our vast pre-1900 collections. We foster a broad community of inquiry through inclusive programs and support of scholarship. We welcome researchers from far and wide to use the collections, both physical and digital, and we host programs like this one that both provide new knowledge about the past and resonate in the present. Tonight's program is part of our LGBTQ+ history series, and you can find more talks in the series on our website, americanantiquarian.org. I'm sure you'll also see that in the chat. Just so you know, this program is being recorded, and you can watch recordings of all of our programs on our YouTube channel as well as on our website. As you are listening to our speaker, please post your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom. We will address them after the speaker's presentation. As you've already seen, Programs Coordinator Lauren Havilis will be putting relevant information into the chat throughout the program. And please know that as a nonprofit organization, we welcome any support you can provide to help keep our work going. Thank you for attending today and for your consideration of ongoing support. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Don James McLaughlin is an associate professor of colonial and 19th century North American literature at the University of Tulsa. His research explores the queer past, health humanities, disability theory, and the history of emotions. He's published essays on queer and disabled aesthetics in multiple scholarly journals. In 2023, he published a new edition of Sarah Orne Jewett's 1885 novel, A Marsh Island, as part of Christopher Luby's Q19, Queer American 19th Century series. In February 2024, the work was #1 on the fiction bestseller list in Oklahoma. I find it really impressive to see anyone reading 19th century fiction, let alone an entire state. So great work there, Don James. Today, we are particularly excited to hear him talk to us about his brand new book, Phobia and American Literature, 1705 to 1937, A Therapeutic History, from Oxford University Press. In fact, today I am told is literally its publication date in the United States. So happy US birthday to Phobia and American Literature. Yay! I had a chance to look at an advanced copy and can tell you this fascinating work does an incredible job tying medical and literary histories together to interrogate the meanings, causes, and emergence of a science of fear across American history. Personally, I was also impressed that he managed to thank his dog, Parker Posey, in a book that talks about rabies. Bold move there. Beyond that, I can tell you firsthand the book is fascinating. Even the table of contents is slyly clever. I haven't even finished the book and have already learned so much about the cultural, political, and etymological foundations of phobias, ranging from isotrophobia, no idea if I said that right, fear of mirrors, didn't know it was a thing, through to the more modern creation of homophobia. So everyone, I fully recommend go place an order at your favorite independent bookstore ASAP. And now, Don James, we are delighted to welcome you virtually back to AAS.
Thank you so much, Sharon. It's been a privilege as a longtime fan of your scholarship to get to know you better over the last several days, and I'm grateful for that generous introduction. I wanted to mention that if you would like closed captioning during this talk, that's something that you can turn on individually on your own Zoom screen. It's on the bottom on the right-hand side. And I wanted to start by mentioning that I absolutely could not have written this book without the fellowship support that I received from AAS and without the expertise offered by the incredible librarians and curators at AAS. I'm indebted to Nan Wolverton, Ashley Cataldo, Kim Toney, Molly Hardy, Laura Wasowicz, Georgia Barnhill, Lauren Hughes, Vince Golden, Dan Boudreau, and Paul Erickson for their generous suggestions and the community that they've cultivated and continue to sustain. And of course, I've mentioned people who are still at AAS and others who have gone on to new opportunities or are now enjoying retirement. But I continue to think so fondly of all of the memories I have with you. And in fact, you all mean so much to me that I have to move on, so not to get too sentimental as I'm getting started. I should also say that you might hear the sound of Parker drinking water right now, which is a really poetic accompaniment for the talk, as you shall soon see. Um, so I'll go ahead and share my screen and get started. So in the spring of 1972, the Philadelphian lesbian activist Barbara Giddings traveled to Dallas with a styrofoam booth, her destination being the American Psychiatric Convention. She and her team there set up a display with a sign that read, "Gay, proud, and healthy. The homosexual community speaks," next to a large red sign with white letters spelling love. And this was the only big public display of the word love at that year's APA convention. This is something that Giddings loved to mention to people who visited the booth. At this same convention, Giddings and her collaborator, Frank Kameny, hosted a panel called Psychiatry, Friend or Foe to Homosexuals, a dialogue, which featured another Philadelphian who famously went by the alias Dr. H. Anonymous. He was disguised in a rubber face mask, a wig of black curls, and a baggy tuxedo. Speaking into a voice disguising Mike, this concealed panelist, who is now known to have been John Fryer, said to his audience, "I am a homosexual. I am a psychiatrist." The next year, the purpose of their effort came to fruition. The APA removed reference to homosexuality as a disorder from the DSM. But Giddings would say, famously, that a stroke of the pen does not change attitudes. The National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, therefore, continued to secure space at future APA conventions. What began initially as a project to depathologize homosexuality continued by promoting gay and lesbian liberation as a boon to public health. At the 1976 Miami Convention, the booth took up a new concept, this one coined recently by New York psychologist George Weinberg, reading Homophobia, Time for Cure. And here on the screen, we have a black and white photograph of this homophobia booth with a large title reading in all caps, Homophobia, and then a subtitle, Time for Cure. 3 attendees adorned in groovy summary attire enjoy the exhibit on the left-hand side. And then on the right, 2 people who are operating the booth in striped shirts with big collars, one standing, one sitting, appear to be having a fun conversation. And this is the kind of photograph I would love to just step inside. Tom Wilson Weinberg's Philadelphia newspaper, the Weekly Gazette, that's right, Gazette, concluded its piece on this exhibit with a quote from the collaborating activist, Ginny Vita, who said, "We hope that the presence of our booth at this year's convention will help psychotherapists recognize their own homophobia where it exists and spur them on to cure themselves of it." So starting with this homophobia booth and kindred advocacy as its horizon, my book, Phobia and American Literature, 1705 to 1937, steps back to trace a therapeutic tradition of facing fear in American literature. A vast but little-known tradition undergirds the triumphs of Giddings and her team. Efforts by disenfranchised groups not merely to defy ideologies that pathologize their communities, but more fundamentally to reorient the discourse to frame civil liberties as a public mental health concern run deep in American letters. In fact, this literary thread coincides with phobia's emergence as a concept, as a variable medical diagnosis, political metaphor, and literary affect. It turns out we cannot tell the story of phobia's emergence as a familiar idea without pamphlets engaged in revolutionary protest, Gothic short stories, anti-slavery newspapers, queer novels, lectures on faith, and creative ventures in the social sciences. Nor can genealogies of thought that bridge early Republican debate to Black organizing, women's suffrage, and LGBTQ plus consciousness be grasped without tracing phobia's analysis as a tradition that has facilitated affiliation among diverse interests. So, as I began the dissertation that then became this book, these were some of the questions I was interested in trying to answer. Why phobia? When does phobia begin to be diagnosed, after all? And when does it become a variable suffix? How also does its meaning change over time depending on context? And this is a picture of astrophobia by the Art Deco illustrator John Vassos, who I discussed in my epilogue. Astrophobia, I should say, being a fear of storms, which is considered one of the oldest and maybe the oldest human phobia. Historians of psychiatry have generally presumed that attention to phobia first emerges with the coinage of agoraphobia by the German neurologist Carl Westphal in the late 19th century, and then continues to sort of blossom in psychological discourse with psychoanalysis and behaviorism in the 20th century. But in fact, this assumption has been mistaken. By the 14th century, variant spellings of phobia had entered the English language by way of a ravaging condition that was called hydrophobia. And there are about 7 images from my research at AAS that I'll be showing this evening. This is the first. And as you can see, this slide, and I should say hydrophobia is a transliteration of the ancient Greek name for rabies and was the dominant name for rabies in early American writing. So on this slide, you'll find an intricate wood engraving of a dog in the throes of hydrophobia, showing foaming at the mouth, saliva dripping from the tongue, a tail tucked between the legs, bristling hair, an agitated expression, and a torn rope dangling from the collar. Reliably, reported cases of human rabies revolved around this symptom, a maddening dread of water induced by painful throat spasms triggered when trying to swallow. Even the sight or mention of water could send sufferers into a frenzy. For early modern readers, hydrophobia conjured a portrait of fear in its most irrational and self-defeating form, very nearly an inversion of the life-sustaining sensation of thirst, except that the subject often desired hydration, despite feeling powerless to accept it. Infamous for its corruption of need by fear, hydrophobia became a valuable subject for the study for the insights it was understood to grant into diseases of the mind. Questions arose as to whether some cases of hydrophobia and, by extension, other irrational fears should be treated as primarily mental phenomena requiring special treatment. At last, hydrophobia's dominion over the phobia suffix began to accommodate a proliferation of new coinages in the late 1700s, medical, cultural, and political. Even during this first great proliferation of the early national and antebellum periods, however, phobia's connotations remained tethered to the term's association with hydrophobia, infusing the affective portrait it conjured with a rabid metaphor. Today, people rely on phobia as a social diagnostic to comprehend the origins of discrimination. Behaviors and policies that negatively impact communities based on sexual orientation, gender identity, ethnicity, race, and religion are understood to be homophobic, transphobic, xenophobic, and Islamophobic. Indisputably, this mode of raising consciousness has been successful. By reframing prejudice through vernacular diagnosis, introspection, and mental health-oriented dialogue, phobia's analysis dissolves stereotypes. Where there was once distrust, phobia's therapeutics humanize the subject regarded as outcast and initiate a collective interpretive mode, one capable of tracing hate to the havoc that can originate in fear. It is also true that phobia's narrow focus on fear has drawn skepticism. Such a focus risks eclipsing the well-being of the target of prejudice, prioritizing the antagonist instead. From another angle, phobia's rhetoric seems nearly to echo a familiar formulation used to absolve the same prejudice it denotes, namely the idea that fear's motivation of discrimination and violence is somehow instinctive and automatic. Why phobia then? How did this six-letter suffix attain such prominence in American liberalism? What have been both the affordances and the lacunae of its rhetorical power? In my book, I argue that phobia initially attained legibility in American culture because it functioned as a metaphor, comparing phobic states of mind to the irrational aggression of rabies. Thus, to grasp phobia's valences during the 18th and 19th centuries, as the suffix experienced its first great proliferation, I embark on six valences that delineate what I describe as the hydrophobia metaphor that was so essential to phobia's early signification. So the first is pathology of the imagination, uh, which is to say that phobia's meaning inhered in its status as pathology and nomenclature. Broadly, hydrophobia represented a disease requiring modes of medical attention engaged with its psychological manifestation, and this is where phobia derived the same associations. I can't talk about this long. This is something I could return to during Q&A. But one of the most important things I looked at while I was at AAS is the source material that inspired an entry that Cotton Mather writes on the dog-bitten soul in his diary. And on the screen, you'll see an excerpt from that diary, which shows how he understood the nature of hydrophobia. He uses this as a way of meditating then on what he calls the devil-bitten soul. So we have an example here of how reflection on hydrophobia provides an analogy for spiritual meditation. And what I show in the first chapter of the book is that this manuscript diary entry is actually a really important manuscript for what became The Angel of Bethesda, which is Mather's great medical manuscript that he published partially as a pamphlet in 1722. But it's just an example of what I'm talking about when I say in this first valence that phobia acquired from its association with hydrophobia its status as pathology and nomenclature. The second valence I talk about is lag time. Within medical literature, hydrophobia stood out among diseases for its unique temporality of incubation. The onset, following the bite of a potentially mad animal, involved a period of uncertain anticipation. And the way the virus works in the human body is, let's say that you're bitten on your wrist, the virus will then crawl up your neural pathways toward the brain, and it does not result in any symptoms until it reaches the brain, and that can take anywhere from a few weeks to months. For this reason, it left people in that state of uncertain anticipation. So during the lag time, in which one might or might not be on the verge of succumbing to the cruel work of this contagious saliva, victims experienced indefinite anxiety. A range of remedies were tried that included hydrotherapy, bloodletting, bezoars, and herbal antidotes. All the while, it was widely understood that these were last-ditch efforts, sometimes called a virus, yet in a context where virus denoted the concept of a poison, as opposed to the microbial entity in the modern sense. The infectious agent consisting within a mad animal's saliva was notoriously deadly. Thus, the question revolved around whether the animal behind the attack was rabid, merely irritable, or sick with a different disease. The anticipation generated by this uncertainty produced a break in one's experience of time. Though an incubation of multiple weeks was normal, doctors often reported many months or even many years. A chronic dread anticipating the dread of fluids thus became a touchstone of rabies narratives and established a paradigm for the temporality that other phobias were understood to engender. So an example is William Dean Howells, the fiction writer who's known especially for his work as editor of The Atlantic, who talks in his autobiography of being suspended in this same state of perpetual anticipation in his childhood after being bitten by a dog in the 1840s. In his autobiography, he says, "The splash of water anywhere was a sound I had to set my teeth against, lest the dreaded spasms should seize me." Waking in a sort of crisis one day, Howells decided to put his anxiety to the test of water, quote, "suddenly dashed from a doorway," unquote. He believed it was the anticlimax that followed when the predicted convulsion failed to materialize that marked a turning point in his life. The moment it dawned on him that, quote, "it was not the fear of that malady which I was suffering, but the fear of the fear." The third valence I talk about is outbreak narrative, a term that I borrow from Priscilla Wald. One of the most complex questions facing historians of medicine in earlier periods is what physicians and lay people understood about the contagious nature of certain diseases before widespread acceptance of germ theory. A very old disease, older than the written record, rabies presents a curious node in that it has been obvious for thousands of years that the bite of a mad dog has the potential to transmit a terminal disease to its recipient. Rabies thus offers an ancient reference point for the evolution of this genre that Wald has called the outbreak narrative, defined as a formulaic plot that begins with the identification of an emerging infection, follows networks of communication, and, quote, chronicles the epidemiological work that ends with its containment, unquote. As a site of potential outbreak, hydrophobia became an important template for conceptualizing what Teresa Brennan has called the transmission of affect. And here on the screen, we have a series of comical illustrations published in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper in the 1860s, which play with this idea of affective transmission. Neither of these images actually depict an actual case of rabies. They both depict instances of performative hydrophobia, and in doing so, indicate that the aggressors are transmitting that state of phobia to the individuals that they are accosting. The authors who most effectively tapped into these associations were those at the helm of anti-slavery print culture, where beginning in the 1830s, editorials began to deploy the portmanteau color phobia to describe a malady of the mind foundational to racial inequality. One of the most remarkable aspects of this early usage of the phobia suffix is that even as such phobias gained rhetorical traction, they continued to depend thoroughly on comparisons to rabies. As the Black edited New York newspaper, The Colored American, edited by Samuel Cornish, Charles Bennett Ray, and James McCune Smith, staged this analogy in 1839, the word color phobia is first cousin to hydrophobia, and so is the thing. It is a terrible insanity produced by the bite of slavery. Building on the work of Derek Spires in his book, The Practice of Citizenship, I propose that one way that these editors and writers built print infrastructures as spaces where citizenship could be both, in his words, theorized and practiced, that is, as both archive and repertoire. They reimagined democratic exchange as a health humanities enterprise, capable of tracing the spread of ideology and disseminating in response a form of psychological immunity through printed material. And as I show in chapter 3, this is something that they're actively theorizing in the newspapers, the idea that print culture can function prophylactically to enable a kind of psychological immunity. The next valence I discuss is zoonosis. Rabies is known today as an example of zoonosis, meaning a disease capable of being passed on naturally from animals to humans. In this respect, hydrophobia represented a state of mind that threw into question the fantasy of human exceptionalism and the hermetic integrity of the species. As I think this valence comes through in other parts of this talk today, I'll go ahead and keep moving on for the sake of time. The fifth valence I discuss is parable. As Priscilla Wald emphasizes, communicability harbors in its logic a converse optimistic scenario, the possibility of stalling further infection through collective action. Accordingly, rabies narratives commonly served as parables, imparting lessons about the prudence of facing fear, as in the children's story, Poor Bessie, published in the Infant's Annual, or A Mother's Offering in 1834. And you guessed it, yes, I have Laura Wasowicz to thank for showing me this during my research. Here on the screen, we have a rough wood engraving which shows the scene of Bessie the dog, white with brown spots, saving young Annette's life from a rabid dog, also white with brown spots, who lunges for Bessie's neck. In a pink dress and short, curly brown hair, Annette raises a branch in an attempt to defend herself. Annette's mother, wearing a blue and pink dress, rushes toward the scene in panic, her arms outstretched. It is clear that without Bessie's intervention, the mother would have been too late to save her daughter from the rabid attack. And the story transpires as Annette asking her mother to be reminded of the story of Bessie's heroism. And as this exemplifies, stories of hydrophobia could be understood allegorically to impart valuable lessons about both the beauty and the potential tragedy of engaging the ill will of fear expressed as hate directly. One of phobias, and so the sixth valence that I look at is what I call consciousness raising satire. One of phobia's core structural features is its seemingly paradoxical status as negative attachment, a high concentration of energy on a specified object, person, or idea, yet by an affective mechanism that alleges to demand distance. In early national and antebellum literature, this relational dynamic attains prominence through phobia's development into a potent locus of social satire. And this really captures the playful comedy of a lot of meditations on phobia in the early national and antebellum periods. On the screen now is a crude wood engraving from AAS collections featuring a dog standing on two legs with its front legs holding an umbrella, pleased with its resourcefulness. The dog smiles with its tongue hanging out and its tail raised proudly. Phobia's affinities with satire surfaced at the intersection of proto-psychiatric speculation and social commentary, where experimentation with phobia as a variable suffix took shape through wordplay and pun making. The literature on phobia thus acquired what I describe in the book as a camp sensibility, the squirrely tenor of a drag diagnostic, which is to say, a performative failure to achieve the tonal seriousness of other diagnostic epistemologies. Camp consciousness raising satire resonates with what Zine Yao has identified as the capacity of affective negations to foster a, quote, insurgent potential, which by virtue of their disaffection from normative political feeling instigates a rupture conducive to the emergence of alternative relational modes. A cunning freedom grew out of this same quality, something similar to what Susan Sontag describes as the readiness of camp to be, quote, alive to a double sense in which some things can be taken, unquote. In phobia's case, this double sense of the words incapacity for diagnosis, or excuse me, the words capacity for diagnosis and parodic imitation of taxonomy generates a tension between fervent lay participation in establishing the terms of public mental health and concurrently a kind of carnivalesque disruption of the sovereignty of the medical gaze to undermine prejudice by a parallel tactic of dethroning the serious. Examples of this are countless and fall variously along a spectrum between sincerity and hilarity. Among them, liberty phobia, government phobia, taxophobia, corporation phobia, verophobia, the dread of truth, Britannicophobia, Gallophobia, aversion to the French, Aaron Burr phobia, state paper phobia, and typophobia, a fear of typesetting. Across this era of phobia's playful expansion, wit became fundamental, as expressly stipulated in an 1802 article, which claimed that the author's editorial opponent must be afflicted with a disease communicated by the bite of a mad goose, called solertiophobia, defined as a dread of wit. On a transatlantic scale, phobia melded ostensibly incommensurable styles of knowing, authorizing the merits of the avidly tongue-in-cheek and just as much the saucily heartfelt. Phobia's earnest irreverence allowed its diagnostician to seize the reins of public mental health. So through these six figurative coordinates, it becomes possible to recover the distinct connotations that phobia comprised at the advent of its first great proliferation as a variable morpheme. One of the most important factors developed through theories that phobia could strike spontaneously. And now I'm going to give you a sneak peek from chapter 2, which is entitled Hydrophobia's Doppelganger, Spurious Rabies and Spontaneous Nosology at the Dawn of Phobia's Versatility. So in this chapter, I explore phobia's development into a variable form of psychopathology by re-encountering the riddle posed by an imaginative pathology known as spontaneous hydrophobia. By the mid to late 18th century, a large number of the most influential physicians in Europe and the Americas considered the condition known as spontaneous hydrophobia, defined as a form untraceable to a bite, scratch, or comparable means of communication, to be a serious phenomenon. Two groups contributed a steady influx of evidence. One comprised persons diagnosed with spontaneous hydrophobia who may have very well been infected and just did not know it. The other seems to have been even more pervasive. For those who had been bitten by or otherwise come into contact with dogs of uncertain health during a period when the nature of infectious disease was fiercely contested, panic often fed upon uncertainty, leading to a psychosomatic generation of symptoms. The impact of this discourse has yet to be grasped by scholars. Attempts to explain psychosomatic hydrophobia in the late 1700s and early 1800s did more than influence interpretations of rabies. They played the greatest role in developing phobia into a category of psychological study. As the belief that hydrophobia could strike as a predominantly mental condition became common, the classification came to signify the first widespread use of the phobia suffix in English to name an irrationally derived pathological fear. In the 1780s and 1790s, as phobia began to be adapted as a versatile suffix capable of being attached to different objects, situations, and ideas, the concept's origins in the literature on rabies continued to play a profound role in shaping phobia's associations. Most importantly, phobia became legible as an imitative mechanism to the extent that it became a kind of competitor term for hypochondria. The familiar lag time between the bite of a dog and the onset of infectious rabies symptoms was integral to this development. In certain cases of spontaneous hydrophobia, physicians began speculating that an antecedent fear of a looming hydrophobia, kindled by overexposure to medical literature, eventually brought the infamous dread of water into being. It became a widely accepted hypothesis, in other words, that in such cases, a manifest hydrophobia was merely a doppelganger of print representations of the disease feared, which, following a sudden irritation in the throat, fantasy of contamination, or some other non-infectious trigger, had held the mind captive for too long. In this literature, phobia's experience began to exceed the dread of water for which rabies was known, encompassing further an anticipatory fear of the disease itself, capable of producing a hypochondriacal imitative pathology by its own means. This branching discourse became essential to phobia's broader proliferation as a category of analysis. George Lepard's short legend, The Ninth Hour, offers one of my favorite spurious hydrophobia narratives relevant to this historical pivot. And I'll read a short excerpt from this chapter that analyzes the short story. First printed serially in the Saturday Courier in the lead up to a book titled Legends of the American Revolution, or Washington and His Generals, published in 1847. The Ninth Hour follows a melancholy ensign named George Murray. Quote, a young man, graceful and slender, almost to womanly beauty, his hair long, dark, and brown in color, waving in rich masses to the shoulders. On his and I should say, I love that this description of George Murray, the character, favors this portrait of George Lepard, the author. So on his expedition as a spy, so the story follows George Murray's expedition as a spy, disguised as a British officer to intercept papers at a Tory farmhouse 9 miles from Valley Forge, holding, quote, the names of all persons within 10 miles who are friendly to the British cause. When Murray volunteers to go in place of a hesitant sergeant tasked with the mission, General George Washington himself takes Murray aside, reminding Murray that it's actually his wedding day. Solemnly, with a quote, expression of indefinable agony, unquote, Murray insists that he do the deed. The reader detects that Murray holds a secret that has left him bereft of hope and a viable future. Upon crossing enemy lines, Murray is caught and strapped to a keg of gunpowder. He attempts to feign loyalty to His Majesty's infantry. To test his allegiance, British soldiers demand he pass a trial. "Do you see that keg of powder thar?" one asks him. "We'll attach a slow match to it, a match that'll take 3 minutes to burn out. You will sit on that keg. Afore the 3 minutes is out, we'll return to the house and see how you stand the trial. If there's a drop of sweat on your forehead or any sign of paleness on your cheek, we will conclude that you are a rebel and deserve to die." For 3 excruciating minutes, the trial proceeds in this fashion. The narrator watches Murray's face, interspersing descriptions of his nonchalant demeanor with updates on the passage of time. Quote, "Not a motion, not a movement of the hand which holds his watch, not a tremor of the face." Finally, the match emits a sudden flame, sparkles, and cracks out, at which point Murray cries to himself, 9 years, 9 days. At last, thank God, it is over. The exclamation echoes an earlier vague reference to the number 9, but is given no context. Once the line is delivered, the narrator reports calmly, "These were his last words. Before the powder exploded, he folded his arms, closed his eyes, and gave his soul to God." This explosive fate turns out to be a hoax on the part of the narrator, which is a very George Lepard thing to do. And the narrator after explains that, in fact, these are the events that followed. The keg was not full of powder and did not therefore detonate. In a serendipitous turn of events, Murray escapes the British. He even makes it back in time for his wedding that evening to his fiancée, Isabel. At last, readers discover the source of Murray's astounding comfort with mortality. Unbeknownst to his comrades, Murray's service in the Continental Army has coincided with another psychological suspense. Just as Murray is beginning to take a sip from an ornate goblet of wine at his wedding, something goes awry. Quote, "He seized it as with the grasp of despair, or as a soldier precipitated from a fortress might clutch the naked blade of a sword to stay his fall, his blue eyes dilating all the while he raised it to his lips. Abruptly, the goblet crashes. Only after the bride and groom have departed for privacy does Murray confess to Isabel, 'The thing which I feared has come upon me.'" Murray goes on to divulge to Isabel that as a child he was bitten by a rabid dog named Wolf. A local healer whispered in Murray's ear that he would, quote, "go mad on the 9th hour of the 9th day of the 9th year." At the time of the wedding toast, Murray realized the day was at hand, with the 9th hour rapidly approaching. Murray goes on to characterize for Isabel his unyielding mental torment. He says, "Need I tell you how this popular superstition fastened on my mind until it became a prophecy? Perchance the poison communicated by the fang of the dog was already working in my veins, perchance. But why multiply words? This awful fear gradually poisoned my whole existence. I began to thirst for death. I sought him in every battle. Oh, how terrible to long for death that cometh not! For I was haunted by a fear, not merely the fear of going mad, but the fear of dying a death at once horrible and grotesque, dying like a venomous beast, my form torn by convulsions, my reason crushed, my last breath howling forth a yell of horrible laughter." For the first time, Murray has disclosed these details of his lifetime spent in the agony of dread. Isabel contemplates the dilemma before she intervenes. Quote, "She had heard of great minds being haunted all their lives by a horrible fear. Some the fear of being buried alive, some the fear of going mad, some the fear of dying some loathsome disease." Unquote. When the clock strikes 9, Isabel lunges for a glass of water sitting on a mosaic table and thrusts it at Murray's face. "Drink, George," she exclaims, "and fear not. If you love me, drink." The command induces a nervous shudder. But then, just as it appears Murray will succumb, the narrator exclaims, "He drinks!" Murray and Isabel embrace. Quote, so spreading forth his arms as the horror of years rushed upon his soul, he fell weeping on her bosom, unquote. In this, the story's second climax, Lepard permits a delayed catharsis of expression withheld in Murray's survival of the powder keg trial. On cue, none other than Washington storms through the doors to witness the bridegroom sobbing in his beloved arms. This resolution to Murray's decade of private dread thus arrives neither with his delivery from British captivity nor with the wedding itself, but rather with a psychological transformation from dread to tearful restoration. One tender message of the scene, I think, deserves to be stated. It's okay to cry, even in front of George Washington. The overarching idea is that liberty in the context of mental unwellness means not the disappearance of illness, but instead a more egalitarian distribution of the authority to comprehend, describe, and exert influence, both over one's mental state and the public mental health of the body politic. This is where Phobia's temporality of anticipation coincides with its connotation of spontaneity. Suspending its subject in the liminality of an impending authentication, Phobia's analysis permitted Americans to engage in the imagination and prophylactic performance of alternative outcomes. Far from being exceptional in its subject matter, Lepard's The Ninth Hour speaks to a phobic imagination that was beginning to proliferate in antebellum American letters. The imitative, hypochondriacal connotations stuck in new permutations of the phobia suffix as well. One of the best examples of how this connotation materialized in new contexts is a string of articles from the 1830s, which address a phenomenon called choleraphobia. Physicians used this portmanteau to account for cases of a performative cholera, where an intensified dread appeared to inspire an imitation of deadly symptoms. In the analysis of prejudice, these connotations remained important even as they took new shape. To succumb to a prejudicial fear of communities based on race, ethnicity, or religion was understood to reflect a performative imitation of a poisonous idea transmitted by divisive media. Phobia's inclination toward variation in language thus made it a powerful framework for prioritizing public mental health in the American body politic. Phobia's analysis taught users to be playful, to speak fiercely, to tell stories, and to stay open. Its success as an incitement to introspection depended on this very encouragement to reimagine and recreate the concept's capacity for application. Never self-explanatory, Phobia's analysis required one to draw new lines of association as a testament to the therapeutic function of metaphor. Possibilities for healing enabled by the compatibility of unlike things. Thank you.
Thank you for that as I make myself visible. We've got some questions in the chat. And we've got some questions in the chat, and I can also ask some. Your preference, that was wonderful. What would you prefer? We've got to get.
I would love to start with a question from you.
Oh, okay. Now I'm on the John, who asked a question in the chat, and the rest of you, just hold on. Oh, I have a list of so many questions because that was fascinating. And the first really general one is, how did you wind up writing a book on a suffix? Like, how in the world did you come to that?
A question I've asked myself many times. As a PhD student in English, I focused on queer theory and the queer past and LGBTQ literatures and literatures that came before that. And so in a seminar with my advisor, Heather Love, we were talking about homophobia as, a contemporary analytic and what feels helpful about it and what doesn't feel helpful about it. And I wanted to know where did this tradition come from? I expected it was a 20th century tradition, and then started digging deeper and deeper in digitized newspapers And when I realized that, and this is something I talk about a lot in chapter 3, that we're so indebted to Frederick Douglass's newspapers for not only putting this playful discursive tradition into motion, but also forcing readers to interrogate its application, not sort of just accepting its connotations, but thinking of it as something to think with and think through. Um, then I just felt really compelled to make this the dissertation topic, and it turned out to have
Mhm.
a lot of unexpected turns that then eventually became a book.
And lots of dogs,
Yeah.
clearly, as mine is happily, of course, being playful, as you said. That is fascinating, and I love I love the way you're tying it to the present, right? And I guess when especially when you were talking about fear expressed as hate directly, I was sitting here and you meant I was going to ask about cholera. You wound up mentioning cholera, but why do some things get the suffix and some things don't? Right? In the modern sense, obviously homophobia, I can think of Islamophobia. Why do some things get the ism, racism, sexism, and others get phobia? Do you that maybe I'm guessing that's post 1937, probably beyond the scope of your book, but you're probably the most knowledgeable person about
Yeah.
this. So what do you think?
It's something I talk about a little bit in chapter 3 as well. I think one. So, when I came out, it was after reading feminist theory that I became utterly obsessed with. So I think, one of the things I always talk about with my students is how important it is to understand LGBT liberation as indebted to what feminism made possible. And I
Mhm.
think that political movements that have been very successful throughout American history, that have been established for longer, have interestingly moved away from the phobia suffix. And I think that's because the phobia
Mm.
suffix has some problematic connotations, which, this book is very
Yes.
dedicated to examining. Um, and so, in the 1890s, racism starts coming into circulation,
Mhm.
and you still find color phobia referenced in
Mhm.
W.E.B. Du Bois's The Crisis,
Mm.
but just not at the same level that you
Right.
find in the antebellum period. And so I think there was this transition away from phobia. I think maybe also because phobia was the satirical
Mm.
concept that maybe didn't always feel appropriate to the seriousness of the topic.
Mm. Right.
Whereas words like racism and misogyny feel like they are attuned to the seriousness of the subject.
Yeah.
And yet, I don't advocate by the end of this book that we should get rid of phobia. Rather, I think we should think about it in the way that people like Frederick Douglass
Mhm.
thought about it, and keep sort of like thinking about its potential as occupying this interesting um, genealogy of storytelling and employing metaphor to help us think through impasses that
Yeah.
might otherwise feel hard to grapple with.
That's fascinating. And as you were talking, it struck me, and then we'll get to one of the questions. It struck me, I could see it being problematic, right? To have phobia being attached to women, attached to Black people, right? Like you're not supposed to be scared of women. There is an admission there if you are scared of people who are meant to be subservient, dependent, etc. So fascinating. Okay, we have a great question from John Locicero. I hope I got that right, John. Who wants to know if there are parallels in the meme of hydrophobia in its hypochondrial aspect to the diagnosis of hysteria. Great question. I'm sure you can talk, if you wouldn't mind, a little bit about, I'm assuming 19th century hysteria. If
Yeah.
you, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm assuming you can, just so everyone's on the same page.
There are connections. I explore some of those connections in chapter 4 and chapter 5. But actually, I think the connections that I'm most interested in the book actually kind of start once new taxonomies of phobia emerge in psychology and neurology as ascendant disciplines. And so the valences are a bit different at that moment. But there's definitely, I think the connection that I would draw between the hypochondriacal dimension of phobia's antebellum meaning is that one of the things I argue in the book is that we can do the history of affect more successfully paying attention to the way emotions operate differently in different times and cultures if we look for their metaphorical associations, if we
Nice.
recognize that
Hmm.
emotion takes shape through literary and textual form. And so that's what I would say. I would really love to read an essay on hysteria that does something like that, that shows us how
Right.
it's attached to various forms and textualities.
Right. No, that is such, I love the methodological approach that you take. Let me do a question from Rachel Walker. Bear with me. It's a long one. Rachel first says, amazing, Don James, totally agree. I've got a question that relates to modern politics. What strikes me about the phobia suffix is that it implies illness or disease, that one is sick in the head.
Mhm.
It also seems, please correct me if I'm wrong, that the phobia suffix tends to be used more often by progressive/liberals, e.g., color phobia to denounce racism, Islamophobia to denounce hatred of immigrants, homophobia to denounce discomfort with queer identities. Okay, so to me, the use of the suffix phobia implies, hey, it's not your fault, you're just sick in the head. In a way, it's a compassionate way of distancing yourself from the enemies rather than marking them as inferior. But then again, diagnosing someone with a phobia is a way of making yourself superior too. And the term is rooted in the condition of hydrophobia, which is notoriously incurable. So is phobia a sort of fatalistic term? Does it imply that bigots are sick, but in a way that can't be cured?
Yeah.
Answer some of that.
And I should say that, as I mentioned in my acknowledgments, I also could not have written this book without the incredible conversations that I've had with Dr. Walker. And I've been so influenced by your work. There are several things I could say. I think the one thing I want to focus on is I asked myself this question a lot as I was writing the book. Like, is there actually something really sad about the connotations of this tradition being, that if rabies is always fatal, does that mean that a kind of, hydrophobia of the spirit, that turns you against your neighbor is also fatalistic? But actually, I think it's the spontaneous hydrophobia archive that illuminated another possibility for me, which is that if the idea is that you actually aren't infected with something fatal, but that you have been taught to perform a prejudice that you have consumed in print culture that was not as well attuned to your own psychophysiological needs, that provides a pathway out. And, in this moment where we're grappling with, you know, the way social media and the spread of misinformation through social media has compromised our democracy. I hope that, one thing this book can do is offer parallels so that, if these earlier writers and editors were able to kind of create this therapeutic imaginary that taught us to be attuned to the way print culture shapes the mind, can we also kind of continue that tradition by rethinking how we want to engage with social media, what we think the guardrails should be, and trying to look to the past to kind of think of creative ways of solving some of our present dilemmas.
Fascinating. May I ask one more question briefly and drag us back to earlier centuries? Um, all of this talk about sort of the impact, the sort of spontaneous ability of one to infect oneself, maybe kind of, made me think of things like maternal imagination, and
Mhm.
which is right, a woman who is pregnant in the 18th century looks at a painting of John the Baptist or wherever, and her baby's born hairy, right? That you know what I'm talking about. I wonder if you can talk more about the way changes in understandings of the different medical theories from the humoral system towards anatomy, more modern systems, change the way we understand phobia. as the body because it used to be the body is just permeable, right?
Yeah.
Everything around you, right? There is the thought if you move to North America, you're going to start to look like native people because you are where you live. You are
Yes.
what you eat, sort of. Do you see those shifts or not? Or is it too
Yeah.
you have 2 minutes.
I know, I don't have a long time.
Sorry.
But chapter one explores this through Mather's the inspiration Mather took from a European physician named Jan Baptiste van Helmont, who proposed that disease happens when a ferment pierces the spirit, releases a seed, and within that seed is an antagonistic idea with a capital I that is trying to remake the subject in its own image. And so, what
Mm,
you do to treat what is essentially a psychological approach to disease
right.
in the early modern period is you create a situation that will answer the might of the
Mm,
contaminating idea so as to help the subject rediscover the
mm.
solace of self-recognition. So
Wow.
I am really interested in the way Phobia provides this window on some
Right.
important precursors to modern psychology that haven't gotten as much attention.
I,
Um,
I love that. Cotton Mather has an answer for everything, and phobia is remarkably and helpfully mercurial, I guess we could say.
yeah.
Um, on that note, I think I'm supposed to do wrap up. Is that
And
right?
I see
Yeah, go ahead.
my friends, my friend Ted Howell and my former
Oh,
student.
more questions. I am so sorry. Can we do some really quick answers? I'm so sorry, folks. I didn't scroll. Um, Don James, can you speak about the ways that phobia suffix operates as a site of conflict between witty coinages by lay people versus doctors as medicine becomes more professionalized?
Yeah, I talk
Talk
about
to.
this in chapter
Mhm.
two, and I do think that's one of the things that phobia represents is a kind of democratization of authority over public mental health. So Benjamin Rush has this really funny article on, diseases caused by the new state of liberty post-revolution. And it's a bunch of funny diagnoses. And at one point he says, I take the liberty of, giving you the diagnosis anarchia, which is a really, funny way of like associating liberty itself with the capacity to kind of proliferate lay diagnoses as another way of sort of collectively thinking through public mental health. And I do think that's something that phobia represents to this day, is that effort to sort of democratize diagnosis.
Yes, and if you can combine these, why do you think 19th century writers so fascinated by spontaneity and destructive onsets? And I think you talked a bit about Cotton Mather, so that we may have gotten Ben's covered. But Julie's Mitchner's question?
Yes, it's amazing to see you in the Q&A, Julie. Uh, yeah, I think I'm trying to think about how to answer this in a single minute. So spontaneous basically means idiopathic. It's so the disease is manifest, but we don't know where it came from or how it got there. And so I think spontaneous became a really valuable framework for thinking about affect as, this emotion is something that suddenly we have no choice but to try to understand and process. How do we do that if we don't know where it came from? But I think then, spontaneity as a framework allowed these writers to explore that very question in a really creative ways.
That is a great answer. And let me just say thank you so much. This is fascinating. I'll be thinking about it for a long time. Just so many ways that this intersects with other aspects of literary and historical events. Let me say, end of evening announcement. Please join us for our next AAS public program on Thursday, October 30th at 7 p.m. Eastern. This hybrid program will feature Richard Copley and Megan Marshall in conversation about their recent books on Edgar Allan Poe and writing biography. This and many other programs are listed on our website where you can register advance. All programs are free of charge, and I wish everybody a good evening. And thank you again, Don James, for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Sharon.